Mason Carter had not even unclipped his employee badge when Amelia Grace, the young chief executive of Grace Automotive, coldly announced his termination in the middle of the main lobby. No reason was given, no severance offered, no chance to explain. Mason simply set the cardboard box down, checked his watch, and walked out into the rain without protest. 5 minutes later, a rumble of engines rolled down the avenue. 20 black Rolls-Royce cars pulled up in a single line before the building, drivers stepping out, bowing toward him, and Amelia froze when the lead man addressed Mason as chairman. Stay with this story all the way to the end to understand why Mason accepted humiliation without ever fighting back. 6 weeks before the termination, Mason Carter walked into the headquarters of Grace Automotive wearing a worn suit and carrying a scuffed leather briefcase, along with a resume that listed nothing remarkable at all. His official title was Contract Risk Analyst, a role far beneath the scale of what he actually controlled. Most employees assumed he was simply a single father trying to hold on to a steady paycheck, and Mason never corrected them. He ate lunch alone, rode the subway like everyone else, and turned down every offer of special treatment that came his way. Nobody in the building knew that Mason was the founder and chairman of Carter Meridian Capital, a private investment fund that managed tens of billions of dollars through a quiet network of holding companies. He had built that fortune from a logistics platform he designed after his wife passed away, and he had deliberately stayed out of the press ever since, protecting the private world he was building for his daughter. Grace Automotive had once been a proud symbol of American luxury manufacturing, but now it was drowning in debt, missed shipments, and expenses nobody could fully explain. Mason's fund was weighing a rescue package worth $2.4 billion, an investment that could save more than 12,000 jobs across the company's plants and supply chain. John Harrison, the chairman of the board, had quietly arranged for Mason to enter the company as an ordinary employee, long before that funding decision would ever be signed. His goal was simple: to watch how leadership behaved when they had no idea that the man who controlled the company's fate was standing in the room with them. On his very first day, Mason noticed a pattern of invoices paid out to parts suppliers that barely seemed to exist on paper. He also noticed that the operating reports reaching Amelia's desk had clearly been edited before they ever left the finance department. Mason did not yet believe Amelia was involved in anything corrupt. If anything, he suspected someone was working hard to isolate her from the truth of what was happening beneath her. A short call with his daughter Mia reminded him, as it always did, that being her father came before any title or any fortune, and he promised her he would come home the moment his work in the city was finished. Near the end of that first week, Mason watched from a distance as Adrian Walker quietly handed a hard drive to Connor Hayes in the underground parking garage, the exchange lasting only a few seconds before both men walked away in opposite directions. Rather than confront either of them, Mason simply noted the time and kept watching, patient in a way that unsettled people who did not understand him. He had learned long ago that a man who reacts too quickly reveals more about himself than the people he is trying to expose. What he did not yet know was that Adrian had already begun to suspect there was something unusual about the quiet analyst, who asked too many careful questions in meetings where he was supposed to stay silent. Adrian had built his entire scheme on the assumption that no one at Grace Automotive was paying close enough attention, and the idea that a lowly contract analyst might be the exception had not yet crossed his mind in any serious way. Still, a small doubt had been planted, and doubt in a building already full of secrets tends to spread faster than anyone expects it to. Amelia Grace had taken over the company after her father died suddenly of heart failure, and the moment she stepped into his office, the entire industry treated her like an heir who had simply inherited a chair far too large for her. She worked nearly 16 hours a day trying to prove she deserved the title, but the harder she tried to control everything herself, the more she found herself depending on the numbers Adrian placed in front of her. Adrian kept warning her that the company only had enough cash to survive 8 more weeks of operations. He insisted that Carter Meridian Capital would walk away from the deal entirely if even a hint of a data leak reached the press. Amelia had no idea that the chairman of that very fund was the same quiet employee who usually stood at the back of her meetings, saying almost nothing. During a plant review, Mason discovered that the production line was running far more efficiently than the official report suggested, which meant someone was deliberately painting a grimmer picture than reality. He calmly raised a question about a missing $180 million, and Adrian responded by mocking him openly in front of the entire leadership team. Amelia did not defend him. She assumed he was simply trying to draw attention to himself in hopes of a promotion he did not deserve. Mason did not grow angry or defensive. He only suggested quietly that Amelia review the raw underlying data herself instead of relying on the summarized version that finance kept sending upstairs. That single suggestion irritated her more than she expected because it touched the fear she carried every day. The fear that she was not actually in control of the company bearing her family's name. Jessica Morgan met with Mason in private and told him that several contracts had apparently been signed using Amelia's electronic signature at moments when she had not even been in the building. Mason asked her to hold off on taking any action, since they needed stronger evidence before Adrian had any chance to destroy the paper trail. Meanwhile, Connor kept a close eye on Mason and noticed he was regularly sending encrypted reports late at night, though Connor had no idea those reports were simply part of the internal security protocols of Carter Meridian Capital. Adrian slowly began to suspect that Mason was not an ordinary employee, though he still could not identify exactly who he was dealing with. He decided the safest move was to remove Mason from the building entirely before the investment delegation arrived to finalize the signing. Late one evening, Adrian happened to pass a quiet hallway and overheard John Harrison speaking to Mason in a tone far too respectful for someone addressing a contract analyst. He caught only a single line: "Everything would be decided on Friday morning." That fragment of conversation was enough to convince Adrian that his entire scheme could unravel within days if he failed to act immediately. From that point forward, every choice Adrian made was driven by urgency rather than patience, and the fear of exposure began pushing him toward decisions far riskier than anything he had attempted before. He no longer had the luxury of waiting for the perfect opportunity, and that desperation would soon lead him to make the first real mistake of his entire scheme, though neither Amelia nor Mason understood yet just how far he was willing to go to protect what he had built in the shadows of a company that trusted him completely. Adrian ordered Connor to copy classified files directly onto Mason's work computer, building a fabricated access history that made it appear Mason had downloaded confidential blueprints for the company's next strategic vehicle line. At the same time, Adrian sent an anonymous tip to Amelia, warning her that an insider was quietly selling secrets to a rival manufacturer. Amelia demanded an immediate security investigation, and Connor made sure the trail led straight to Mason's desk. Inside his computer, the investigation team found files marked top secret alongside a fabricated log showing data being transferred outside the company network. Mason recognized instantly that the evidence had been planted, yet he chose not to reveal who he truly was, not even in that moment. Instead, he asked Amelia a simple question: had she verified the server logs independently, or was she simply trusting whatever Connor had reported to her? Adrian interrupted before she could answer, insisting that the evidence spoke for itself and that Mason was clearly trying to stall for time. He reminded the room, in a tone dripping with practiced concern, that a security breach of this size could sink the rescue package before it ever reached a signature, and that every additional minute of hesitation only made the company look weaker in front of the very investors it desperately needed to impress. Jessica proposed suspending Mason temporarily while a proper legal review took place, a suggestion Adrian fought against, since he knew a genuine investigation would eventually expose his own fingerprints. He pushed Amelia harder, reminding her that the board was watching closely to see how she would handle the crisis. Amelia thought back to every whispered remark suggesting she was too soft to run a company this large, and in that moment, fear guided her decision far more than the facts in front of her did. Mason was summoned to the glass conference room on the top floor, where Amelia demanded an explanation for why classified files had appeared on his machine. He answered calmly, telling her that the company's internal security system had already been compromised from within. He did not name Adrian directly, wanting the man to believe his plan was still unfolding exactly as intended. Mason asked for exactly 2 hours to prove what he was saying. Adrian immediately reminded everyone that the investment delegation was arriving that very morning, and any delay could jeopardize the entire rescue package. Amelia looked at Mason and announced that he would be suspended immediately, pending further review. Behind the scenes, however, Adrian quietly altered the paperwork, changing a temporary suspension into an outright termination for what he labeled a serious violation of company policy. Near the end of that tense morning, Mason received a message from his own team confirming that 20 representatives from the investment fund had already landed in Manhattan and were on their way to Grace Automotive at that very moment. He glanced at his watch and realized the convoy was now only minutes away from the building. Whatever happened next inside that lobby would happen in full view of the very people who held the company's future in their hands, and there was no longer any way to slow down the collision that Adrian had unknowingly set in motion. Somewhere beneath the polished floors of that lobby, a plan built on lies was about to meet a truth that no amount of forged paperwork could hold back much longer. Mason understood that the next few minutes would decide far more than his own reputation, and he chose deliberately to let events unfold exactly as they were already headed, trusting that the truth would arrive on its own schedule rather than one he forced into being. Adrian had no intention of letting Mason walk away quietly, since he wanted to destroy the man's credibility completely before the investment delegation ever set foot in the building. He convinced Amelia to announce the termination publicly in the main lobby, insisting it would send a firm message to every employee watching. Jessica objected, pointing out that the file had never been properly verified, but Amelia was already under enormous pressure from the board and from reporters circling the story. Hundreds of employees were summoned down to the lobby under the pretense of an urgent security announcement, filling the open floor with quiet, nervous chatter. Mason stepped out of the elevator, calm as ever, with Connor trailing close behind him like a shadow that refused to let go. Amelia read the termination decision aloud, accusing Mason of unauthorized access to the company's protected intellectual property. She gave him no opportunity to respond, since Adrian had warned her that anything Mason said publicly could create serious legal exposure for the company. Several employees quietly recorded the scene on their phones, capturing a moment none of them yet understood the significance of. A few whispered among themselves that the whole thing felt wrong, that a man so careful and so quiet did not deserve to be dragged down to a public floor and stripped of his badge in front of strangers, yet none of them dared to say so out loud. Colleagues who had once relied on Mason's quiet help now stared at the floor, unwilling to speak up on his behalf. Mason asked Amelia only one question: was this truly her own decision, or someone else's decision wearing her name? Amelia answered that she was the chief executive, and every decision made inside that building belonged to her alone. Mason unclipped his badge and set it gently on top of the cardboard box at his feet. Inside that box sat only a few notebooks, a fountain pen, and a small drawing from his daughter Mia, turned face down so no one else could see it. He did not beg, did not threaten, and did not reveal who he truly was. Before turning to leave, he said quietly that power is never proven by how many people a person can dismiss, but by how many mistakes that same person is willing to own. Amelia hesitated for a fraction of a second, but Adrian quickly signaled to security before she could reconsider anything. Mason walked out into the Manhattan rain without looking back. Adrian, believing he had won completely, ordered the staff to prepare a proper welcome for the arriving delegation from Carter Meridian Capital. 5 minutes passed in near silence, the kind of silence that settles over a room right before something irreversible happens. Then a low rumble of engines rose from the avenue outside, growing louder with every passing second until it was impossible for anyone standing near the windows to ignore. 20 black Rolls-Royce cars pulled into a single unbroken line in front of the building, bringing the surrounding traffic to a near standstill. Amelia and her leadership team stepped out through the glass doors to greet them, expecting handshakes and formal introductions. One by one, the men in tailored suits stepped down from their cars, but none of them walked toward Amelia. Every single one of them turned instead toward the man still standing quietly at the curb, holding nothing but a soaked cardboard box, and the entire lobby fell into a silence heavier than anything Amelia had ever experienced in her professional life. A silence that told her, before a single word was spoken, that something about this morning had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The first man to step out of the lead car was a senior representative of Carter Meridian Capital, and he opened an umbrella over Mason before addressing him, in full view of every employee watching, as Chairman Carter. The remaining passengers were leaders of 20 different family funds and banking partners who had already committed to the rescue package for Grace Automotive. Each of them had arrived in a separate Rolls-Royce simply because they had all just left a luxury investment conference nearby, a detail that had nothing to do with Mason and everything to do with ordinary scheduling. Mason had never arranged the convoy as a show of force. The cars arrived exactly on the timeline that had been agreed weeks earlier for the signing, and it was only the timing colliding with his termination that turned an ordinary arrival into a moment no one in that lobby would ever forget. Amelia realized in a single devastating instant that the man she had just dismissed was not some low-level representative, but the very person who controlled the outcome of the entire deal. John Harrison stepped forward and confirmed to everyone present that Mason was indeed the founder and chairman of Carter Meridian Capital. He explained that the secret evaluation had been approved by the board itself, meant to uncover the real reason the company kept losing hundreds of millions of dollars it could not account for. Amelia turned toward Adrian, who feigned complete shock and swore he had known nothing about any of it. Adrian's tone shifted instantly, insisting the termination had simply been an unfortunate administrative mistake that could easily be corrected. Mason told him plainly not to alter a single document. He announced that the termination would remain exactly as written, standing as proof of how leadership behaved under pressure when they believed no one of consequence was watching. Amelia asked for a conversation, but Mason declined. He informed the room that the $2.4 billion investment package was being suspended indefinitely, effective immediately. All 20 partners confirmed, without hesitation, that they would follow whatever decision Mason made, and not one of them raised a single objection or asked for further explanation, a silent kind of loyalty that told everyone in that lobby exactly how much authority the quiet man in the worn suit truly carried behind the scenes. Within minutes, news of the suspended deal began spreading, and shares of Grace Automotive started sliding on the open market. Mason showed no satisfaction in any of it. He instructed his legal team to protect employee wages and keep every plant running for the next 30 days regardless of what happened at the executive level. That single instruction made clear he had no interest in punishing thousands of ordinary workers for the mistakes of a handful of people at the top. Mason left in the final Rolls-Royce, but rather than taking the back seat, he chose to sit beside the driver, the soaked cardboard box still resting on his knees. Amelia stood beneath the entrance awning and understood, without a word being said, that real power had just walked out of the building without ever needing to raise its voice. Later that afternoon, Adrian retreated into his private office and placed a call to someone whose name he never spoke aloud. He told the person on the other end that Mason had surfaced far sooner than expected, and that they now had barely 48 hours to finish moving the money before anyone came looking for it. His voice carried none of the confidence he had shown just hours earlier in front of the cameras, and for the first time since the scheme began, Adrian understood that the timeline he had built his entire plan around had just collapsed without warning. Once the convoy departed, the board of Grace Automotive convened an emergency session within the hour. Several members demanded Amelia's resignation, arguing that she had fired the man controlling the rescue package without ever ordering an independent investigation. Amelia did not shift blame onto anyone beneath her. She admitted openly that the final decision had been hers alone to make. It was the first time she had ever accepted responsibility publicly instead of trying to protect her own image in front of the board. John gave her 72 hours to uncover the truth before the board would vote on removing her entirely. Jessica handed Amelia the original version of the suspension document, and together the two women discovered that the file had been altered after Amelia's electronic signature had already been applied. Her signature had been copied onto an entirely different termination order without her knowledge or consent. Amelia began reviewing every file Mason had once urged her to examine herself. She discovered that more than $180 million had been funneled through 3 supplier companies connected to people with ties to Adrian. Worse still, Grace Automotive was quietly preparing to sell a strategic manufacturing plant for nearly $400 million below its true market value. The buyer turned out to be a shell company owned by a rival manufacturing group. Amelia finally understood that Adrian had deliberately engineered the company toward insolvency piece by piece, hiding every warning sign behind polished reports that made a collapsing business look merely cautious rather than catastrophic. Once the company collapsed, he intended to sell its assets to that same rival and collect an enormous commission for himself. Amelia went to the hotel where Mason was meeting with his partners, hoping to speak with him directly. His security team initially turned her away, since Mason had no interest in a meeting that might turn into a staged apology for the cameras waiting outside. Amelia waited nearly 3 hours in the lobby without complaint. When Mason finally appeared, she did not ask him to immediately restore the investment deal. She asked him only what he needed to prove the truth. Mason answered that he needed evidence, not promises. He told her she would have to investigate her own company herself if she wanted to prove she still deserved to sit in that chair. Amelia agreed without hesitation, understanding for the first time that trust from a man like Mason would never be handed to her freely, only earned through actions no one could later dispute. Mason gave her exactly 24 hours to secure the accounting servers before Adrian could find a way to erase everything stored on them. Near the end of that tense conversation, Amelia called Jessica but received no response at all. Every computer inside the legal department shut down simultaneously, screens going dark all at once across the entire floor. A fire alarm began blaring throughout the building despite no smoke or flame anywhere in sight, a clear sign that someone was deliberately forcing every employee out of the building before anyone could stop what was about to happen next. Amelia felt a cold, sinking dread settle over her as she realized the 72 hours John had given her might not matter at all if the evidence itself disappeared before she ever had the chance to present it. She sprinted toward the stairwell instead of waiting for an elevator, aware that every second now counted more than it ever had before in her entire career, and that whatever was unfolding inside that building would decide far more than just her own future as chief executive. Adrian had triggered the false alarm specifically to empty the building, giving Connor exactly the window he needed to destroy the accounting servers before anyone could examine them properly. Amelia realized his true goal was never chaos for its own sake, but simply erasing every piece of data before the investigation could begin in earnest. She called Mason on the private number John had given her earlier that week. Mason was already on his way to the airport, but he immediately told his driver to turn the car around. He was not returning to rescue Amelia's position as chief executive. He was returning because thousands of employees could lose their livelihoods if the evidence vanished before the truth ever reached daylight. Mason quietly activated the technical investigation team at Carter Meridian Capital. This time, no convoy of luxury cars arrived, since he deliberately traveled in an unremarkable vehicle to avoid drawing any further attention to himself. Mason, Amelia, and Jessica met at a technical entrance behind the building, away from the crowd still gathered near the main lobby. Jessica had managed to back up a portion of the company files just before the systems locked down completely. Connor spotted them and ordered the remaining security staff to block Amelia's access to the building entirely. Amelia announced firmly to every guard present that she remained the company's lawful chief executive regardless of any rumor circulating that morning. Some guards hesitated, since Connor insisted Amelia had already been suspended by the board. Mason produced written confirmation from John proving that Amelia had never actually been removed from her position. The three of them made their way down toward the server floor. Connor had already disconnected several hard drives and was preparing to load them onto a maintenance cart bound for the loading dock. Mason did not resort to any physical confrontation or dramatic heroics. Instead, he used his fund's ownership stake in the monitoring software license to remotely lock every device that had already been disconnected from the network. Jessica triggered an emergency evidence preservation order through the legal system, a procedure she had prepared quietly days earlier in case something like this ever happened. Financial investigators were notified immediately, though it would still take time before officers could physically arrive on scene, and every minute of that delay felt heavier than the last, as the three of them worked to hold the evidence together with nothing but a preservation order and their own determination. Amelia confronted Connor directly and demanded he hand over the hard drives without further delay. Connor refused at first, but then admitted, almost carelessly, that Adrian had promised him $5 million once the sale of the manufacturing plant was finalized. Mason quietly recorded the entire confession on his phone without either of them noticing. Connor tried to flee through the parking garage but was stopped by security officers stationed at the gate before he ever reached his car. Adrian, meanwhile, had already slipped out of the building through a private exit reserved for senior executives. Before leaving, he initiated a wire transfer meant to move $180 million overseas before anyone could freeze the account. Mason discovered the countdown attached to that transaction almost immediately after checking his phone. They now had less than 20 minutes to stop the money from disappearing for good, and every second that passed brought Adrian one step closer to escaping with a fortune built entirely on other people's ruin, leaving Mason and Amelia with no choice but to move faster than either of them had ever moved before in their entire careers. Mason reached out directly to the partner banks working with Carter Meridian Capital, since his fund guaranteed a portion of Grace Automotive's credit line and therefore held the authority to freeze any suspicious transaction moving through that account. Still, to fully block the transfer, the bank required a valid signature from the acting chief executive. Amelia discovered that her signing authority had already been quietly revoked through a fake board resolution Adrian had fabricated days earlier. Jessica found system records proving the resolution had actually been created after the date printed on the document itself. They sent that evidence to the bank only seconds before the wire transfer would have completed. The $180 million was frozen just in time. Adrian called Amelia directly, no longer bothering to pretend any loyalty toward her at all. He declared that she would lose the company regardless of whether the money had been saved. He had already leaked a collection of documents to the press, suggesting Grace Automotive had committed accounting fraud under Amelia's leadership. Those documents carried her signature, making it appear to the outside world that she was the mastermind behind the entire scheme. Mason told Amelia she faced two choices: hide in silence to protect her personal reputation, or step forward publicly and expose every wrongdoing regardless of how it made her look. Amelia chose to hold a press conference that same night without waiting until morning. She admitted openly that she had failed to properly oversee the company's financial systems and accepted responsibility for the weakness in her own governance. She did not declare herself innocent before investigators had reached any conclusion of their own. Her honesty caught Adrian completely off guard, since his entire plan depended on her trying to hide her mistakes rather than confessing to them in public. And a company scrambling to bury its own failures is far easier to frame as guilty than one standing openly in front of the cameras admitting exactly where it went wrong. Mason appeared at the press conference but deliberately did not stand beside Amelia. He confirmed that Carter Meridian Capital was conducting an independent audit and would release every finding, whether or not it reflected well on Amelia personally. That single act proved he was not showing her any favoritism at all. Connor agreed to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence. He gave investigators Adrian's hiding location along with recordings of his private dealings with the rival manufacturing group. Adrian was arrested at a private airfield while preparing to leave the country entirely. He still believed he could avoid conviction, since most of the fraudulent paperwork bore Amelia's forged signature rather than his own, and he assumed wrongly that a company desperate to move past a scandal would rather settle quietly than pursue a costly prosecution all the way through court. Near the end of that long night, Jessica discovered a deleted video file sitting in Adrian's old office computer. The footage appeared capable of proving that Adrian had used a signature duplication device to forge Amelia's authorization on dozens of documents, but the file itself had been badly corrupted during the deletion process. Jessica spent hours trying every recovery method she knew, aware that without that footage, Adrian's lawyers might still find a way to shift blame back onto Amelia in front of a jury. She finally sent the corrupted file to Mason's technical team just before dawn, uncertain whether even their specialists could recover anything usable from data that damaged, but hoping, quietly, that one piece of luck might finally fall in their favor after everything else that had gone wrong. Mason's technical team managed to recover most of the corrupted footage by morning. The recovered images showed Adrian and Connor using an administrative account to forge Amelia's signature across a series of critical documents. A separate audio fragment captured Adrian directly instructing Connor to plant classified files onto Mason's work computer. The evidence cleared Mason completely of every accusation ever raised against him. Investigators also confirmed that Amelia had not participated in any embezzlement. Though the inquiry concluded she had made serious governance mistakes throughout her tenure, mistakes born less from malice and more from a young leader who had let fear of appearing weak override her own better judgment time and again. The board convened a formal session to decide whether Amelia would remain as chief executive going forward. Several members wanted her removed immediately to calm nervous investors and reassure the wider market. Another faction pushed to sell the company outright to Carter Meridian Capital, while its value remained depressed. Mason refused to exploit the crisis to acquire Grace Automotive at a discount. He argued that any deal built on desperation could never form the foundation of a company strong enough to last. When asked directly whether Amelia deserved to keep her position, Mason declined to answer on behalf of the board. He simply laid out the complete truth as he understood it. Amelia had fired him without adequate grounds, yet she was also the same person who returned to protect the evidence, halt a fraudulent transfer, and expose the wrongdoing publicly rather than hide behind it. Amelia walked into the meeting without a single prepared statement in hand. She admitted she had confused rigidity with real leadership, believing for years that a chief executive always had to project certainty, even in moments when the full truth remained unknown to her. Amelia asked the board not to excuse her of any responsibility, and she said so plainly, without the practiced calm she once used to project confidence she did not actually feel. She voluntarily agreed to limit her own authority for 6 months, accept independent oversight of every major decision, and forfeit her entire bonus for the year. She also asked the board to formally restore Mason's reputation in front of the whole company. The board voted to let Amelia remain as chief executive, on the condition that she carry out a full program of internal reform, one that would be measured not by promises made in a boardroom, but by results the entire company could eventually see for itself. Mason announced that Carter Meridian Capital would resume its review of the investment, though he refused to sign anything immediately. He laid out 5 conditions covering transparency, protection for whistleblowers, and stronger guarantees for the well-being of every worker across the company. Amelia accepted every single condition without attempting to negotiate a single one of them. Near the end of that long meeting, Mason was offered the chance to become co-chief executive alongside Amelia. He declined the offer without hesitation, explaining that he had no interest in taking another person's seat after having just proven, in the most public way imaginable, that power should never be used as a tool for revenge. He told the board plainly that stepping into that chair now, after everything that had happened, would turn the entire ordeal into something it was never meant to be. A story about who ended up on top, rather than a story about what the truth was ultimately worth to the people who had fought hardest to protect it. And he had no interest in rewriting that meaning, simply because the opportunity had finally presented itself to him. Adrian was formally charged with financial fraud, document forgery, conspiracy to embezzle company funds, and obstruction of an active investigation. Connor pleaded guilty and continued cooperating fully with authorities throughout the case. The rival manufacturing group was forced to abandon its plan to purchase the undervalued plant entirely. The money that had been illegally transferred was fully returned to Grace Automotive. Mason insisted that the company prioritize payments to its smaller suppliers first and guarantee every employee's wages without delay. The $2.4 billion investment package was finally signed after a full month of independent auditing. The signing ceremony took place in the very same lobby where Mason had once been publicly fired. He refused to allow any extravagant staging or self-congratulatory imagery built around his own role in the story. Instead, he insisted that factory workers, engineers, and supplier representatives stand at the very front of the room. Amelia publicly withdrew every accusation ever made against Mason. She admitted, in front of the cameras, that she had judged him based on his title, his appearance, and evidence that had never actually been verified. Mason did not demand that Amelia kneel, resign, or endure any similar humiliation in return. He said plainly that forcing someone else through the same pain he had experienced was not justice at all, only the same cycle of pride repeating itself in a different direction. Mason agreed to serve as chairman of an independent strategy committee for a period of 1 year. He limited his involvement to 3 days each week so that he could return home to Mia far more often than his old schedule had ever allowed. Mia never once appeared at the company. She simply sent her father a short message saying she was proud he had not become a bad person just to defeat one. That message moved him more deeply than any formal speech ever could have, since it confirmed the one thing he had quietly hoped for throughout the entire ordeal, that his daughter still recognized him as the same father she had always known, regardless of what title or fortune the world now attached to his name. Amelia slowly began reshaping her entire approach to leadership. She started holding direct sessions with employees at every level, required every report reaching her desk to include raw underlying data, and established an independent reporting line for anyone wishing to report wrongdoing without fear. She stopped dismissing employees based solely on the word of a single powerful subordinate. The relationship between Mason and Amelia gradually shifted from open conflict toward quiet mutual respect. There was no sudden romance between them, only trust rebuilt slowly, month after month, as they worked together to help rebuild the company from the ground up, each of them learning, in their own way, that leadership built on fear could never hold as steady as leadership built on honesty freely given. Near the end of that long year, Amelia finally asked Mason why he had not revealed his true identity the moment he was fired that morning. Mason answered that he wanted to know, honestly and without any doubt, exactly which version of herself Amelia would choose to become in a moment when she believed he held absolutely no power over her future at all. Since a person's character is never truly tested by how they treat someone powerful, but by how they treat someone they believe they can dismiss without any consequence whatsoever, And that answer, more than any signature on any contract, was the one thing Mason had actually come to Grace Automotive to find. 1 year later, Grace Automotive had recovered dramatically, paying down most of its short-term debt and reopening the very plant that had once nearly been sold out from under it. More than 12,000 jobs remained protected throughout the entire ordeal, a number that meant far more to Mason than any headline ever could, since each of those jobs represented a family somewhere quietly depending on a paycheck that would still arrive on time. Amelia still held her position as chief executive, but she no longer led through fear of appearing weak in front of others. She had learned to ask questions, welcome disagreement, and openly admit whenever she did not yet have enough information to decide. Mason completed his term on the strategy committee and chose not to renew it, wanting instead to focus fully on his fund and on the time he had promised to his family. During the ceremony marking the company's recovery, Amelia presented Mason with his old employee badge, now framed carefully behind glass. Beneath the badge, there was no mention of his fortune or his title, only a single short line reminding anyone who read it that a person's worth never changes based on how others choose to treat them. Mason accepted the gift but said it was never meant for him. He told her the frame belonged instead in the executive boardroom, where every future leader would see it before making any decision that could affect the life of a single employee. Amelia agreed without hesitation, and from that day forward, every executive who walked into that boardroom passed beneath the framed badge before they ever sat down to make a single decision affecting someone else's livelihood. When the ceremony ended, a Rolls-Royce waited outside for Mason, exactly as it always did these days. He looked at the car for a long moment and smiled, but he did not step inside. Instead, he chose to walk alongside Amelia down the avenue, with no security detail, no convoy, and no cameras following behind them. Amelia asked whether the 20 Rolls-Royce cars from that first morning had been arranged deliberately. Mason laughed quietly and explained that the convoy had simply arrived on its already scheduled timeline, nothing more. The only thing he had truly chosen that day, he told her, was refusing to seek revenge when he had every opportunity to take it. The story closes with Mason's old employee badge hanging permanently in that boardroom, a quiet reminder standing behind every closed-door decision made from that point forward. 5 minutes had been enough to reveal exactly who Mason really was. But it took a full year for Amelia to understand that what made him powerful was never the 20 luxury cars that once lined the avenue outside her building. It was something far quieter than that. His ability to hold on to his own dignity in the one moment when everyone around him assumed, wrongly, that he had absolutely nothing left to lose, and that quiet steadiness, more than any fleet of cars parked outside a building, was the only inheritance he ever truly wanted his daughter to grow up understanding.